August 1944. German intelligence officers are poring over reports from the Western Front, and they're starting to smile. The Americans have just pulled off the impossible breaking out of Normandy in a thunderous offensive. But Berlin isn't worried, because they know something the American soldiers racing across France don't know yet. They're about to run out of gas, literally. The German generals had done the math, and the numbers were brutal. Every single day, Patton's Third Army alone was consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel. That's enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool. And they were 400 miles from the nearest functioning port. The Wehrmacht had spent years building a sophisticated logistics network across Europe. They had rail lines, fuel depots, repair stations, and entire infrastructure designed for modern mechanized warfare. And they'd just destroyed most of it during their retreat. So when German commanders saw American tanks charging forward at breakneck speed, they weren't panicking. They were waiting for the inevitable moment when those tanks would sputter to a halt, when the trucks would run dry, when the entire American offensive would grind to a standstill. One German officer reportedly told his staff, "Give them 2 weeks. Their logistics will collapse under its own ambition." He was almost right. Here's what the situation looked like in August 1944. The Allies had just liberated Paris. Patton's army was racing toward Germany. Victory felt close enough to taste. But behind the glory, there was a crisis brewing that threatened to end the war before Christmas in Germany's favor. Every port the Allies could use was either destroyed or hundreds of miles behind the front lines. Cherbourg was operational, but it was a logistical nightmare to get supplies from there to Patton's spearhead. The closer ports, Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais were still in German hands or so thoroughly demolished they were useless. The railroads, bombed into oblivion by Allied air forces. The canals, blocked. The roads, never designed for this kind of traffic. And the supplies needed weren't just bullets and beans. Modern warfare runs on complexity. Spare parts for Sherman tanks, medical supplies, ammunition for dozens of different weapon systems, food for hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and above all, fuel. The American war machine had become a victim of its own success. They'd advanced so fast, they'd outrun their supply lines by hundreds of miles. On August 25, 1944, a decision was made that would change everything. It wasn't made in some grand strategy room with generals and politicians. It was made by logistics officers who knew that sometimes the simplest solution is the only solution. They called it the redballexpress. The name came from railroad terminology. Red ball trains were priority freight that had to get through no matter what. And this convoy system would operate the same way. One route, one direction at a time, round the clock, no stopping. Here's how audacious this plan was. They were going to dedicate entire highways exclusively to supply trucks. Northbound traffic only on certain roads, southbound on others. Every vehicle had a red ball painted on its side for identification. And they would run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, through enemy territory, air attacks, and whatever hell the roads threw at them. The trucks themselves were GMC 2.5-ton workhorses, not glamorous, not fast, but reliable. Each convoy would have hundreds of them, nose to tail, grinding forward at 25 miles per hour. But here's the detail that German intelligence missed, the variable they didn't account for: the drivers. Of the roughly 23,000 men who drove for the Red Ball Express, about 75% were African American. This was 1944. The military was still segregated. These soldiers had been relegated to support roles, denied the chance to fight in combat units, told they weren't good enough to serve alongside white soldiers. And now the entire Allied advance depended on them. They called themselves the Road Warriors, and they understood something profound. They were in combat. Just because they weren't firing rifles didn't mean they weren't in danger. German fighter planes would strafe convoys. Retreating Wehrmacht units would lay ambushes. The roads themselves were killers' blown bridges, bomb craters, curves that would send a loaded truck tumbling. Drivers would stay behind the wheel for 20 hours straight, popping Benzedrine tablets to stay awake, navigating by moonlight with headlights taped to thin slits. One driver, Private William McLeod, later recalled, "We weren't delivering supplies. We were delivering victory. And we weren't going to let anyone stop us." By September, the Red Ball Express was moving 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. Think about that number. That's the weight of the Eiffel Tower every day, on roads that were falling apart. The trucks drove so fast and so frequently that the highways began to disintegrate under them. Maintenance crews worked around the clock just to keep the routes passable. When one road became impassable, the convoys would improvise driving through fields, towns, wherever they could find passage. And Patton? He was advancing so fast now that German commanders couldn't believe their intelligence reports. Towns that were supposed to take weeks to capture fell in days. The entire German defensive line was collapsing. But the cost was staggering. Drivers were dying from exhaustion, from accidents, from enemy fire. Trucks were breaking down at catastrophic rates. The Red Ball Express was consuming itself to keep the army moving. In early September, one convoy commander was told his unit had a 30% breakdown rate. His response? "Then we'll drive the other 70% twice as hard." The German generals stopped laughing. Their strategic calculations had been perfect, except they'd forgotten to account for human determination. The Red Ball Express ran for 83 days from August to November 1944. In that time, it delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies and transported millions of gallons of fuel. It kept Patton's advance alive long enough to reach the German border. When the port of Antwerp finally opened in late November, regular supply lines could resume and the Red Ball Express was disbanded. The trucks went back to regular duties. The drivers returned to segregated units. Most of them never received the recognition they deserved. No medals for logistics. No movies about truck drivers. Just a footnote in most history books. But here's what matters. When German generals reviewed what went wrong with their defense of France, logistics wasn't just mentioned. It was central. They'd been outsupplied by an enemy who refused to let the math beat them. There's a photograph from September 1944. It shows a Red Ball Express truck, battered and covered in dust, parked next to a newly liberated French village. On the side of the truck, someone has chalked, "Berlin or bust." That driver didn't bust. None of them did. The Red Ball Express didn't just fuel Patton's blitz. It proved something the German generals never understood, that logistics isn't just about numbers and efficiency. It's about the people who refuse to stop when the numbers say they should. The next time someone tells you that wars are won by great generals and brilliant tactics, remind them of this. Sometimes the war is won by thousands of truck drivers who just kept going when everyone said it was impossible. The German generals had laughed at American logistics. They stopped laughing when the Red Ball Express drove right through their calculations and kept going all the way to Germany. That's what determination looks like when it has an engine and a mission. If this story moved you, hit that like button. And if you want more forgotten stories from World War II, subscribe. We're just getting started. Thanks for watching.